Welcome to the detailed instructions of the Maisy shorts. The Maisy shorts have fake turn-ups, which you can see here, and we've got some really lovely side pockets with faux piping. We've got darts in the front and waistband with a special technique devised by myself, and then we've also got plenty of space in the bottom department for a nappy, especially important for the smaller sizes. So let's start. When you're cutting out, my measurements say 50 to 70 centimeters really for 140 wide, but if you've only got 22 inches wide, so you actually have a much smaller fabric, you can shimmy them into each other. I turned over the back here to make sure it fits. The facing for the pocket and the waistband, you're cutting from a different fabric, and therefore you need not as much fabric for this. The pocket I've cut out after, but of course you could cut the pocket before you cut the whole lot out. That would be possible too. When you're cutting out the back, you need to make sure that if it's on the wrong side, you turn it over to the right side in order to mark your darts. That's quite important. You don't want to be sitting there later on and having forgotten that. So you can mark either both sides or the center. Doesn't matter which. We're also cutting out the pocket and remove the pins because we need it again for the pocket, which we'll be cutting out in the lining fabric as well, which is my check. Then when you're cutting out the front, you're cutting the dart all the way down. Now your dart on your pattern is a lot shorter because my husband noticed this when he came home. He said, "Oh no, that looks like something for a boy." And I noticed it too straight away, and I thought, oh no. So I made them shorter so we get the perfect pleat. The pocket goes under here, like so. And basically that's everything cut out that we need in the shell fabric. Now we're going to cut the waistband, the facing and the pocket. For the waistband, it's best to rip it because that way the width will be exactly the same. You could put in eyelets, but I haven't done that on this simple one, but of course you can, and there's a separate video showing you how to put in the eyelets. I'm also cutting out my pocket facing, and again you could cut this in either direction, straight or across, that's fine. There's some detailed instructions as to the width of the elastic, of course, in the instructions that you get with a pattern. We begin by putting together the pocket, so you put them together right hand sides facing, and then you leave a turning gap, so you sew all the way around. Make sure that the turning gap is left on that little straight part because otherwise it's really hard. Sometimes people leave it on the curve, and of course that's incredibly difficult to get right afterwards. So you sew all the way around, and you should do a few stitches and then lift the presser foot with the needle down so that you get a really nice curve and your fabric doesn't start pleating or anything. That works the best. Now we're going to cut back the seam allowance about 2 to 3 millimeters, and in the area where you left your turning gap you need to make sure that you leave it because it's really hard to turn it and keep that seam allowance in if it's too slim. Now we're going to turn a pocket from the side furthest from the gap, so just wiggle that through there and then pull. That's easiest. All right, now we can iron it, so make sure that you bring out all the lovely curves, and if anything of the lining peeps out, that's not a fault. I think that's actually really nice. Fold over the top and also iron, and then you also iron the other side exactly the same. Next, we are going to top stitch along that top edge, and we're using something called a triple stitch, and you can see it on your sewing machine. It's the one which has 3 lines next to each other. It's also sometimes called a jersey stitch, and that stitch goes backwards and forwards, making it really thick and structural. Now we're going to sew the darts, so you can either just use the center snip that you've done and you use that as the middle and then just put a pin there. Important here is that the edge of the fabric lies on top of each other, so totally straight, and then when we're sewing the dart it'll automatically come out right. So make sure that they're lined up, and that's what the pin holds here. And now we're going to sew them down. You can measure them, it's 9 centimeters, but you don't necessarily have to. If you sew straight down, it'll automatically give you a dart. But if you're a beginner, then I would suggest that yes, measure it, put a pin there, and then you know it's right. Iron the dart towards the body middle, in this case it's the back, and then we're going to top stitch again on top of our dart, holding that seam allowance, so to speak, in place, and we're using the triple stitch again, and it's so much easier than using a much thicker embroidery thread because that kind of loops underneath it, and not every machine can cope with it, but even the most basic machine will have this stitch, and it looks absolutely fantastic. Now we're going to position the pockets. Cut out the positioning area, and then you can just put on your pocket over the top and you know where it has to go. So a couple of pins will secure that pocket in place, and then of course you'll have to do that on the other leg as well. And now we're ready to top stitch these down. So again, I'm using the triple stitch, and I'm starting at the very top, and I make sure that the upper part, which is folded over, is well caught in that. So I'm using the little red markings on the presser foot. On the fuff, I've got 2 red markings on either side there, and I think you can just about make them out, and that's really good. So if you have got a presser foot like that, it makes it a lot easier. If you don't, you have to find your own kind of gauge as to how far over from the edge of the fabric you want to be, but this comes out as about 2.5 to 3 millimeters, and I think that's just perfect. I'm securing the thread here. Now I can do my front pocket. So you put your facing on with the right sides facing each other, and you sew this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Cut back the seam allowance. Again, we're talking about 3 millimeters roughly here, so it's really slim. And now we're going to turn this in, and then we're going to iron it so that the seam allowance peeps out a little bit, and that actually looks like piping, so that's a really good way to get an effect without any effort at all. So now we're going to put the pocket underneath it. The round side has to slide in so it matches up with the round side of the pocket facing. And there we go. Line it all up. And now we're going to put a number of pins in here just to hold the pocket in place. So when I fold this back now, I can pin my pocket, and then I'm going to sew it together all the way around. And if there's a little bit of a difference, you could just trim that before you sew. So pin it, and then we're going to sew it. 1 centimeter seam allowance again. It's always a centimeter seam allowance with me. Sometimes I get letters, people ask me, what's the seam allowance? It's always a centimeter. So all the way around. Remove my pins here, and I fold back the pocket so I can now top stitch the edge of my pocket. That's really important, because if you don't do that, the moment you wash this, it's going to be not holding in place anymore, and you forever have to iron this piping back in, and you want it to really sit securely there. So triple stitch again all the way around. And there you go. Now I'm going to overlock that. So under the overlocker, you just guide this round. There we go. And I'm pulling the fabric towards the right. That's the way to get round curves, but never down. Some people pull it down and then the stitching looks really, really tight. Pull it over to the right, and you get your overlocking threads really close to the edge, and they are not too tight because you haven't pulled it downwards. Good press. And now you want to secure with a couple of pins where the pocket sits, so that when I'm working with it, it doesn't move. And I'm going to top stitch this down as well, close to the edge, just to hold it in place in a minute. And while we're there, we're also going to do the center front. 1 centimeter seam allowance. And again, turn when you get to a curve, needle down, turn, take your time going around the curve. That's a really tricky bit there, and you don't want this to be jaggedy or anything, so take your time. Lock your stitches in at the end, and there you go. We're going to overlock this as well. Make sure the knife's turned off, because this is where people cut in. I still disable the knife for that part of sewing. It's so much easier. Now we're going to do the center back. We're going to do a centimeter seam allowance all the way down. This is not so hard to do the curve on this one, but you do really need to stick to the seam allowance there. Make sure it all lines up. Overlock. You can see that I enabled the knife again. It's fine, that curve isn't really very tight, so you can get round. Now we're going to iron the seam allowance towards the right. So move your fabric over from one side there, and just iron in there with the tip of your iron. The front of your trouser, you iron the seam towards the left-hand side, so that when you're done, they're both facing the same way. So one goes to the right and one to the left. so that when you later on sew them together, they face the same way. You want to iron some Vilene onto the wrong side of the center front, and that's to stabilize that center because we don't want that to crunch up when it's worn. Putting the Vilene on, a good measurement is count to 8, and that should fix it on. I've speeded it up here. Doesn't look speedy, does it? So you have got stability now, and now I'm just going to quickly secure the pocket onto my trouser while I'm there, and then I go back to my trusty triple stitch. And with that triple stitch, I'm going to do the center front and the center back, because that is just beautiful. You could do 2 lines like you do on a boy's shorts, so you could have another line foot width, not using that little red line, but the foot width. But for a girl, I don't think it's necessary, and because that's much more difficult to do. That first line goes in really easy. The second line would be quite difficult, and if you made the boys' trousers, you'll notice that. And I leave that up to you. I think it wasn't necessary. I left it just with a 1 stitching line here, and I think that's great. We do the same on the front. If you've ironed this really well, you don't really need to force the fabric apart, but I should always have my hands on it and make sure that actually, you know, it's ironed properly, so you can pull the fabric apart a little bit just to make sure. So now we're going to do the side seam. So you're going to pin them edge to edge again, and it's 1 centimeter seam allowance. When you are sewing, you never look at the needle. I just thought I'd mention this again. You line up your fabric with the lines on your needle plate, and that's where your eye is. Never on your needle, because by the time it gets to the needle, it's too late anyway. Then we'll overlock these, and you always overlock with a good side on top, and that means that all your seams are going to be ironed towards the back. That's like a basic rule of sewing, and so you want the really nice overlocking to be seen. So you can see it here, it looks different to that side, so always from the top. Now I'm going to iron them towards the back, and you can see that beautiful line of overlocking showing. Now I'm going to top stitch with a triple stitch again down here. That's my side seam, and because you left the inner seam open yet, it's really easy to go in there. That is not hard. You have to turn your trouser to the wrong side though, and then work so it's like lying on the inside. Otherwise you're never going to be able to do this, but if you do this, it works really fine. It's quite easy to do. There's no need to secure the stitches actually when you're doing a triple stitch, so just cut the threads off and you got a beautiful top stitching line. Might want to give that a good press again, and we can now put on our waistband. And what I would suggest is that you always put it on one side, and then you put the center back on, so you need to fold them over, fold them in half so that you can mark that, whether you do that with a snip or just with the fingers like I'm doing here, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to put a pin in there. Go to the other side. And that's the side. And then you fill it in with the rest of the pins. You don't need to over pin any of this. Just a few will do. And when I'm stitching this, I'm going to, of course, be guided by the checks. So I worked out which check it is that I need, where the centimeter sits, and then I'm going to go all the way around. And take the pins out when you're actually on top of them, quite literally, because if you take them out too early, then there's no point to putting them in the first place. And then at the end, you secure your stitches. Iron the seam into the waistband. Make sure that that's really nice and crisp. Really pull from the bottom a bit so that you get that nice sharp edge. Now we can do the darts. Please remember that your darts are much shorter, and that might look a tiny little bit different to this, but it'll look, of course, much better with a shorter dart. So anyway, always pin your dart from the top if you can. I've actually done one of them from the lower part there, but really it would make much more sense to do it from the top because it's just easier to sew. So pin them. And then when we're sewing them, we are this time not aiming to have them like running out literally off the fabric as you would when you put a dart into a skirt or something, so that it gives you the body shape. This is to make a pleat. So in fact, we want to sew in almost that nose at the bottom. And at the same time, we can also pin together our inner seam so that that leg is shut as well. So again, put one pin at the very end, one where the seams meet each other in the middle, and then another pin on the other side, and then I fill in with a few more pins in between, and I can stitch that with a centimeter seam allowance. Here it's really important that the fabrics lie edge to edge, especially where you have the tip, otherwise you end up with a little widow's peak, which is not very nice and it doesn't sit very well. So make sure they're just edge to edge. Go to the end and lock in your stitches. Job done. Now we're going to stitch our dart, and like I said, we'll take a centimeter seam allowance to the point where it actually ends, and then just a little bit below that we curve in and we come off the fabric. And now we're going to have a little bit of an overlock fest, I would call this, because we're overlocking for quite a while. So overlock the darts, both sides, and then we overlock all the way along the inner seam of the trouser leg. And then, when we've done that, we're not stopping. Now we're going to overlock. Yes, we're going to overlock the top edge. And now here's something I did wrong 5 times. 5 times on all my samples for every single size. I've had the pleats going the wrong direction. You can see it there. They need to go towards the body middle so that the pleat will spring open towards the side seam. So exactly the opposite. So make sure that they are, and I would suggest that you maybe iron them first, because it's so easy to do that wrong. I didn't even notice that. And then finally we're going to do the legs, and again the seams want to face the back, so you might want to check that, and then we'll overlock all the way around. Now we can do the hem. This one I've already done, so it's turned up and stitched through on the overlocking. So you turn it in 3 centimeters and then you put some vertical pins in all the way along so that you can just stitch over them and you don't need to take them out. Then you place that over the sewing machine onto the arm and you start at the inner leg seam so that you can't see the backwards and forward stitching, and I sort of wiggle my fingers there to help the fabric go and move around the arm. It's something I do automatically, but if I don't tell you, I thought you might not notice that motion. Secure your stitch. And now you flatten out your seam allowance there and you fold it up so it's 1 centimeter longer and just put that on the seam and pin it. And that gives you the fake turn up. So what we're going to do now is stitch that down right in the seam, and on the other side, on the outside leg, we're going to top stitch over the top stitching, and that gives you a beautiful fake turn up. And if you're looking at the stuff that you've bought from the shop, you will come across this technique quite a lot. It's very easy and also it saves a lot of fabric. So fold it up and sew directly in the seam. It's a great trick, really. I love doing it like this. It's very easy. If you want to do a proper turn up, you can watch the video with the blue fabric and the little tie in the front and the loops, and I show you how to do a proper turn up. But I like this one, it's quicker. Fold in your waistband next. Needs to be 4.5 centimeters to allow for 4 centimeter wide elastic to go through there. And again, we're going to stitch this down in the seam. So what you want to do is just pin it all the way around. Now I have a check, and with a check I could have just pressed this. I didn't need to pin this as well as this, but I think it's always good to show how you should be doing it. And now I can stitch it down. Again, put it on the arm of the machine and start where the waistband starts. And just underneath or in the seam you can stitch along. If you're unsure that you can do that, it's better to go 1 millimeter lower than to have it squiggling all over the shop. That doesn't look so good. So whatever is best for you. Secure your stitching at the end. And you really are almost there. This is so exciting. You can now put in the elastic. So put a safety pin on the middle of the elastic. I think that's easiest, really. After 5 of them, I've worked out, put it in the middle and it's best. Anyway, then you push it through until it's all in and flat so that you've got the end of the elastic overlapping just 1 centimeter. So it's in line with the seam allowance of the dart. And there I had to go a little bit more, so you needed to pull it in a little bit more until you have it just in that perfect position, just like that. And then just put a pin in there and top stitch it before you carry on working. So just top stitch on that edge there, and then you can thread through the rest of the elastic, of course, without even worrying about pulling it out by accident, because that's a bit annoying, and we've all done it, I think. At least I have, plenty of times. So pull it through all the way now to the other side. And we're doing the same again. We want it to be really flat, and the seam allowance should sit in there with 1 centimeter. And when we've got it just right, it's actually quite easy and you can feel it as well. Then we're going to top stitch that down on the other side. And that means the elastic is totally secure in there. Take out your safety pin now. I forgot that. Take the safety pin out, stitch down the other side. And that's basically it. It's together. You could, if you wanted to, just leave it like that. You don't need to do any more top stitching on the elastic if you don't want to. If you think, oh, I can't really do that, or it's going to be a bit squiggly wiggly, then just leave that off. But if you want to do that last step, I think it makes it look a bit more like a shop bought item. So we just want the arm again. We slide on our little trouser and then we decide where we want those stitches to be. I do them 1.5 centimeters from the top, 1.5 from the bottom. But to be fair, you can do them where you like. You could spread them out evenly or like me so that the middle gap is a little bit bigger. That's up to you really. So the first line goes across. Now when you stitch that elastic and you're really stretching it, you want to make sure you don't overstretch it or you pull too hard because you will break your needle. And when I did it, not with this fabric, this was really easy, but when I did it with a really thick fabric where I put the eyelets in, the needle broke 3 times. So you want to really evenly pull that across for your stitching line. And then we put another line on the other side. And of course you could put buttons on there as well. That would be really nice. So button either side or something. I think that would be good. And when we've gone to the end and secured our thread, we are actually done. So this is the fairly easy and plain version of this trouser, which I think is really cute and is totally adequate for the summer. I think the fabric you're using will really make it. This looks so much nicer in real life than it does on this video. I was a bit disappointed that you couldn't really see the pattern as beautifully as I saw it when I actually worked with it. So we've got this beautiful trouser finished. We've got lots of leg room, lots of nappy room. What you also can do is you can put eyelets in. So there's a separate video showing you how to put these eyelets in, and you can play about with which part you replace with a contrast fabric. Here I've left the pocket off, for example, and then of course you can step it up and you can put some ties on the front and some belt loops. I've done a hem trim here as well, and these really, really gorgeous Megan pockets with elastic at the top. And of course there are videos for all of that showing you exactly how that works. And you've got a separate pattern for the belt loop, the tie and the bow. So have fun sewing, and I see you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye.